On March 25, 2024, Homeland Security agents, guys in heavy tactical gear, rolled up to a $40 million mansion in the Holmby Hills neighborhood of Los Angeles.
Right, they arrived in actual armored trucks.
Armored trucks, aerial support, the whole 9 yards. And they weren't executing, a standard drug bust. They were executing this massive, coordinated federal search warrant aimed at uncovering the logistical paper trail of a pop culture empire.
It was happening simultaneously at another property in Miami, too.
Exactly. Inside that mansion, agents found AR-15 rifles. But more crucially to the federal case that would follow, they found the physical inventory of what prosecutors would later call a criminal enterprise, including, most notoriously, 1,000 bottles of baby oil and lubricant.
Yeah, and it was a visual that completely shattered 3 decades of carefully curated public relations. Just seeing federal agents carrying boxes of evidence out of the estate of one of the most powerful men in the history of the music industry.
Surreal.
It really was. It was a profound paradigm shift. It signaled that an entire era of untouchability had effectively ended.
Welcome to our deep dive. Today, our mission is to unpack the staggering rise, the labyrinthine legal unraveling, and the profound historical reckoning of Sean Diddy Combs.
Right.
We are looking at a truly massive archive of materials to understand this story for you today. We have the complete federal indictment from the Southern District of New York. We have the day-by-day trial transcripts from the intense 2025 federal case in Manhattan.
Not to mention the extensive socio-legal reports and cultural analyses of the 1990s and 2000s.
Yeah, biographical records, in-depth trial coverage from outlets like CBS and The Guardian. Our goal is to figure out exactly how a billionaire music mogul, a man who essentially architected a defining era of global pop culture, ended up as an inmate serving a multi-year sentence at FCI Fort Dix.
And we really need to emphasize the scope of the information we are synthesizing here, because this isn't just a story about a single court case.
No, not at all.
It is a deeply complex narrative about corporate power, the mechanics of the music industry, the evolution of federal law, and a cultural shift in how society views and prosecutes systemic abuse.
Right. And before we go any further, a necessary and very clear disclaimer for you, the listener. We are going to be discussing severe, highly publicized allegations today.
Yeah, heavy stuff.
Very heavy, graphic details of physical and sexual abuse, and the specifics of a major federal conviction. As we walk through this timeline and these documents, we are impartially reporting the contents of these sources, the legal filings, and the ultimate outcomes of the trial.
We're not taking political or personal sides here.
Exactly. We are simply here to synthesize and convey the facts, the historical context, and the ideas contained in the original source material.
Because the tone of the extensive documentation we've reviewed is, rightfully, one of sober realization. It's a heavy journey through a very dark reality that was hidden behind, a very bright spotlight.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand the sheer gravity of where we are today, with Sean Combs sitting in a federal prison in New Jersey, we absolutely have to understand the unprecedented scale of the empire that fell.
Right, you have to look at the foundation.
Yeah, how did he build this machine in the first place?
Well, you really have to travel back to the late 1980s and early 1990s to grasp the magnitude of his influence. Before he was a federal defendant, Sean Combs was the absolute blueprint for the modern hip-hop billionaire.
Born Sean John Combs in Harlem in 1969, right?
Right, and his early life was entirely shaped by the harsh realities of that era. When he was just 2 years old, his father, Melvin Combs, was shot and killed.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the biographical records we are looking at note that his father was an associate of Frank Lucas, the infamous New York convicted drug lord.
So he's raised by his mother, Janice, who was working multiple jobs to keep them afloat. And he ends up at Howard University in Washington, D.C. in the late 80s. But he wasn't really there for the academics, was he?
No, not at all.
The records show he immediately started building a reputation as a massive concert and party promoter. He was renting out halls and throwing events that would draw thousands of people. He was already testing his ability to control a crowd and, market and experience.
He was testing his capacity for logistics, really.
Yeah.
Throwing a massive party requires security, it requires permits, marketing.
And an acute understanding of what people want before they even know they want it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But he ends up leaving Howard University, dropping out to take an internship in New York at Uptown Records under Andre Harrell.
I want to pause on Uptown Records for a second because I feel like people gloss over this part. What made Uptown so pivotal in the early 90s?
Well, Uptown was the epicenter of New Jack Swing and the fusion of hip-hop and R&B.
Mhm.
And at Uptown, Combs isn't just fetching coffee. He is remarkably ambitious.
Right.
He quickly becomes instrumental in developing the sound, the swagger, and the visual aesthetic of massive acts like Mary J. Blige and the group Joe Pesci. He essentially helps invent hip-hop soul.
He had this innate, almost terrifyingly sharp ear for what was going to dominate the radio.
He did. He understood that you didn't just sell a song, you sold a lifestyle.
But then he gets fired from Uptown in 1993. The historical accounts say he was just too ambitious, clashing with Andre Harrell over control and direction.
Yeah.
And a lot of people might have just faded away after losing a high-profile A&R gig in their early 20s.
Yeah, most would.
But instead, he pivots immediately and founds his own label, Bad Boy Records. And he brings a young, relatively unknown Brooklyn rapper with him,
Christopher Wallace.
the Notorious B.I.G. Biggie Smalls.
Yes. This partnership is the bedrock of the entire Bad Boy empire. Together, they essentially rewired the DNA of 1990s hip-hop.
Because up until that point, a lot of hip-hop was gritty, it was highly localized, deeply rooted in the struggles of the streets.
Right, and Bad Boy ushered in what cultural historians call the shiny suit era.
It was aspirational, it was flashier, heavily reliant on recognizable pop and R&B samples, and it was undeniably commercial. They were making music for the clubs, for the radio, and for MTV all at the same time.
I mean, the music videos looked like high-budget short films with helicopters and speedboats.
Yeah. It was a transition from regional storytelling to global commercial dominance. But then, as we know, the East Coast-West Coast rivalry escalates, culminating in tragedy. Biggie is murdered in Los Angeles in 1997.
And this moment serves as a massive defining pivot point for Combs. He doesn't retreat behind the executive desk.
Right.
He transitions from being the producer, the hype man, the executive, to stepping directly into the center spotlight as a solo artist.
Under the name Puff Daddy. He releases his debut album, No Way Out, and I was reading through the cultural retrospectives in our stack of sources, and there's a fascinating, almost chilling detail.
Oh, but the original title.
Yeah. The original title of that album, before Biggie was killed, was supposed to be Hell Up in Harlem. But after the murder, he changes the title to No Way Out, and he anchors it with the tribute song to Biggie, I'll Be Missing You.
Featuring Faith Evans and 1 and 12, heavily sampling the Police's Every Breath You Take. And that song doesn't just do well, it breaks industry records.
Totally shatters them.
It becomes the first rap song in history to debut at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, and it stays there for 11 consecutive weeks. The commercial success was unprecedented. He won Grammys. He was suddenly one of the most recognizable faces on the planet.
And as the years go on, we see this constant, deliberate evolution of his public identity. He goes from Puff Daddy to P. Diddy, then drops the P and becomes just Diddy, and eventually he starts calling himself Love, or Brother Love.
Right.
It's almost like observing the constant corporate rebranding of a Fortune 500 company, but applied to a single human being.
Because he recognized that the music was just the loss leader. The music was the billboard advertising the actual product, his lifestyle. He realized early on that to maintain generational wealth and absolute power in the entertainment industry, you have to vertically integrate. You can't just rely on album sales, because cultural tastes shift.
Wait, walk me through that. How does vertical integration work for a hip-hop artist in the late 90s and early 2000s?
Think of it as a closed-loop economic system.
Yeah.
You own the record label, so you control the music. The music videos for those songs act as highly produced commercials.
Okay.
What are the artists wearing in those videos? They're wearing your clothing line. What are they drinking in the VIP sections of the clubs your music dominates? They're drinking your branded liquor.
Oh, wow.
You capture the audience's attention with the song, and you monetize every single physical manifestation of the lifestyle that song portrays.
That makes perfect sense. It's like he built an entire ecosystem where he was the sun, and every artist or brand was just a planet orbiting his gravity.
That's a great way to put it.
So in 1998, he launches the Sean John clothing line. And this is important. It wasn't just cheap celebrity merchandise printed on standard T-shirts. He took it seriously.
Very serious.
He pushed his way into high fashion, eventually winning the highly prestigious Menswear Designer of the Year award from the Council of Fashion Designers of America in 2004. He was beating out traditional luxury houses.
And then you look at the spirits industry. In 2007, he strikes a revolutionary deal with Diageo, one of the largest alcoholic beverage companies in the world.
Right.
He doesn't just endorse Ciroc vodka, he partners to develop the brand, taking over the marketing for a 50% share of the profits. He essentially takes a struggling middle-tier vodka and turns it into a status symbol synonymous with luxury nightlife.
And he doesn't stop there.
No, he follows that up by co-founding the Revolt TV network in 2013, moving into media ownership. He buys a major stake in Aqua Hydrate, a bottled water company. He was relentlessly stress-testing the limits of what a musician could own and control in American capitalism.
So you have this staggering immense wealth and this sprawling corporate footprint. But a business portfolio alone doesn't make you untouchable.
Right.
Alongside the financial acumen, he builds this incredibly powerful, heavily insulated social machinery. This is where we need to talk about the white parties.
The white parties are central to understanding the mythology and the absolute power of Sean Combs. They ran roughly from 1998 to 2009, primarily held at his estate in the Hamptons over Labor Day weekend.
And they had that crazy dress code.
Yes. They were famous for a strict, uncompromising all-white dress code. If you showed up in cream or off-white, you were turned away at the door, completely regardless of who you were.
The sources we're analyzing emphasize that these weren't just lavish celebrity parties. We need to strip away the glamour for a second and look at the function they served.
Right.
For over a decade, an invitation to a white party was the absolute pinnacle of social status and cultural cachet in America. It was the physical nexus where Hollywood royalty, the top tier of the music industry, high fashion designers, Wall Street billionaires, and even powerful politicians all converged.
By controlling the guest list to the most exclusive room in the country, he positioned himself as the ultimate gatekeeper. He was the bridge between street culture and elite corporate America.
Yeah.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that position as a gatekeeper created what socio-legal analysts refer to as his protective media shield. Because he wasn't just throwing parties, he was deploying strategic philanthropy.
Right. He donated millions of dollars back to Howard University. He raised massive funds for Hurricane Katrina relief.
He ran the New York City Marathon to raise $2 million for the public school system. He spearheaded the Vote or Die political campaign in 2004, registering young voters and rubbing shoulders with presidential candidates.
He embedded himself into the civic architecture of the country. And if you trace that logic, you start to see how this immense visibility, combined with his status as a gatekeeper, completely insulated him from accountability.
Absolutely.
To cross Sean Combs, to write a negative story about him, or to accuse him of wrongdoing, meant risking your entire career. You'd be cut off from the record labels, you'd be blacklisted from the parties, you'd lose the lucrative brand deals. The media shield wasn't an accident, it was a highly maintained perimeter.
And that perimeter was tested violently multiple times over the decades. We have to look at his track record of escaping legal consequences because it conditioned the industry to believe he was truly untouchable.
Okay, let's look at December 1999, the shooting at Club New York in Times Square.
This is a wild piece of history.
It really is. Combs is at this club with his then-girlfriend, Jennifer Lopez, and his protege, a young rapper named Shine. An altercation breaks out at the bar, guns are drawn, and 3 bystanders are shot. Combs and Lopez flee the scene, run a red light, and are pulled over by the NYPD. Police find a stolen, loaded handgun in the vehicle.
So he goes to trial in 2001, facing weapons and bribery charges. The media circus was intense, but he hires Johnny Cochran, he mounts an aggressive defense, and ultimately, Sean Combs is acquitted of all charges.
He walks away completely free.
He just walked away. Meanwhile, his young artist, Shine, is convicted of assault and reckless endangerment and sentenced to 10 years in state prison. The contrast in their fates was a stark demonstration of Combs' power to navigate the justice system unscathed.
And that wasn't the only incident that year. Earlier in 1999, he was involved in the severe physical assault of record executive Steve Stout over a music video dispute.
Oh, right.
Combs literally marched into Stout's office with his bodyguards and attacked him with a chair and a champagne bottle. It was a brutal beating. And what happens? He pleads guilty to a reduced charge of harassment and is sentenced to attend a one-day anger management class.
A literal slap on the wrist.
Yeah. Then you fast forward to 2015. There is the highly publicized kettlebell assault incident at UCLA. Combs is watching his son, Justin, participate in football practice.
Right.
He gets into a heated confrontation with the strength and conditioning coach, follows him into his office, and allegedly swings a heavy cast-iron kettlebell at him. He is arrested by campus police on suspicion of assault with a deadly weapon. But again, the charges are quietly dropped by the Los Angeles City Attorney's Office due to lack of sufficient evidence.
Over and over again, the armor holds. Whether it's a nightclub shooting, a corporate office beating, or a collegiate athletic facility assault, the Diddy machine absorbs the impact and keeps moving.
Because the ecosystem he built absolutely required it to hold.
Exactly. Think about the corporate entities we just discussed. The television networks, the spirits conglomerates, the major record distributors, the streaming platforms. There was a massive shared financial interest in keeping Sean Combs viable.
Hundreds of millions of dollars relied on his continued presence in the culture.
And when that much money is at stake, it naturally generates a pervasive, impenetrable culture of silence.
But empires built on silence have a fatal flaw. They are inherently fragile. You can build a fortress of non-disclosure agreements. You can hire the most aggressive crisis PR firms in the world. You can intimidate witnesses.
Right.
But all it takes is one single person who decides they no longer care about the consequences of speaking out. One person who refuses to be managed.
Which brings us to the specific date when the foundation of this 30-year monolith finally gave way, November 16th, 2023.
Let's focus intently on this date because the legal mechanics here are crucial. Cassandra Ventura, known to the world as the R&B singer Cassie, files a massive federal civil lawsuit in the Southern District of New York.
And the timing of this filing is not an accident. It is a masterclass in legal strategy. She utilizes a highly specific piece of legislation called the New York Adult Survivors Act.
We need to explain how this law functions, because without it, this entire reckoning likely never happens. Historically, the justice system places a statute of limitations on most crimes, including sexual assault.
Right.
This means that after a certain number of years, victims lose the right to sue their abusers in civil court. The reasoning was originally about the preservation of evidence and reliable testimony.
But psychological research and advocacy over the last decade have proven that trauma doesn't adhere to a legal calendar. Survivors often take years, sometimes decades, to process what happened to them and find the safety or courage to come forward.
Right, and in recognition of that reality, the state of New York passed the Adult Survivors Act. It created a special, temporary one-year look-back window.
A massive legal loophole, essentially.
Yeah, for 365 days, survivors of sexual offenses could file civil lawsuits against their alleged abusers and against the institutions that enabled them, completely regardless of when the abuse actually occurred. That window opened in late 2022, and it was set to expire permanently on November 24th, 2023.
And Cassie Ventura filed her suit on November 16th, just 8 days before the door slammed shut forever.
The allegations contained within that 30-page complaint were staggering, graphic, and highly detailed. She alleged a relentless, decade-long cycle of rape, sex trafficking, and severe physical abuse that began shortly after she met him in 2005 when she was just 19 years old and had signed to Bad Boy Records.
The lawsuit didn't just allege isolated incidents of domestic violence. It outlined a systematic campaign of coercion and total control.
Yeah, she detailed how he tightly controlled her medical records, her housing, her career trajectory. She alleged he forced her to carry his firearm in her purse, that he introduced her to a relentless stream of narcotics.
And most disturbingly, that he forced her to engage in drug-fueled sexual encounters with male sex workers while he directed and filmed them, events he allegedly referred to as freak-offs.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The response from Combs' legal and PR camp was immediate, aggressive, and entirely predictable based on his past playbook.
They released statements calling the allegations outrageous lies and characterizing the lawsuit as blatant blackmail, driven by a demand for money. They tried to deploy the media shield.
But I am struggling to understand the sheer whiplash of what happens next. They vehemently deny everything, threaten to fight it in court, and then exactly 1 day later,
1 day.
24 hours after the lawsuit is filed on November 17th, they announce a settlement. The press release says the lawsuit has been resolved amicably and to the mutual satisfaction of both parties. We later learned through the subsequent federal trial testimony that the settlement figure was $20 million.
$20 million wired almost instantaneously. His legal team spun this to the press as a purely pragmatic business decision. They claimed he just wanted to spare his family the trauma of a prolonged public spectacle, insisting that a settlement is not an admission of legal guilt. But, I mean, you have to look at the structural reality of this moment. When a $20 million settlement fails to buy silence, what does that tell you about the shifting cultural tide?
Break that down for me. Why did a $20 million settlement, which normally would have buried a story like this, fail so spectacularly?
Because the culture had irrevocably changed since the 1990s. In the era before social media, a quick settlement and an aggressive PR firm could absolutely kill a story. But in 2023, the sheer speed of the capitulation was deafening.
He was too fast.
Way too fast. To the public, and more importantly, to other potential victims and to federal investigators, wiring $20 million within 24 hours to make a 30-page human trafficking complaint disappear doesn't look like a pragmatic business decision. It looks like sheer, unadulterated panic.
It looked like a desperate attempt to plug a hole in a dam that was already giving way. The public perception shifted, literally overnight. The armor of the untouchable gatekeeper was gone.
And whatever tiny sliver of deniability his defenders were still clinging to completely evaporated a few months later, in May 2024.
The CNN video leak.
Yes. CNN obtains and broadcasts exclusive high-definition surveillance video from the Intercontinental Hotel in Los Angeles. The timestamp on the video is March 2016.
And it is horrific to watch.
It really is.
It shows Sean Combs wearing only a white hotel towel and socks, sprinting down a hallway. He chases Ventura to the elevator banks. He grabs her by the back of the neck, violently shoves her to the ground, and begins kicking her while she is down. He then attempts to drag her back down the hallway by her sweatshirt before eventually throwing a glass vase in her direction.
The visual evidence was indisputable. It perfectly, chillingly corroborated one of the specific, highly detailed assaults that Ventura had outlined in her November lawsuit.
The same assault that his representatives had publicly called an outrageous lie just months prior.
Exactly. After that video saturated the internet, the PR strategy collapsed entirely. Combs released a self-recorded apology video on his social media accounts, looking disheveled, calling his actions in the 2016 video inexcusable, and claiming he was disgusted with himself.
He stated he had sought therapy and rehab, but it was far too late for a managed apology tour. The initial lawsuit by Ventura and the subsequent confirmation provided by that video didn't just crack the dam, it obliterated it.
It really did. It opened the floodgates for a massive, unprecedented cascade of civil litigation. The volume of the filings was staggering. According to the court dockets we've reviewed, by October 2025, over 70 separate civil complaints have been filed against him in federal and state courts.
Wow, 70.
Over 70. And when you read through these complaints, the scope and the timeline are deeply unsettling. It wasn't limited to a specific era. It stretched across his entire adult life.
Let's detail some of these specific accusers because it shows the systemic nature of the allegations. You have Joy Dickerson-Neal, who filed a lawsuit alleging she was drugged, sexually assaulted, and secretly filmed by Combs when she was a college student at Syracuse University way back in 1991.
And then you have Crystal McKinney, a former MTV model, alleging he assaulted her in his New York studio in 2003 after plying her with drugs and alcohol.
It wasn't just women from decades past either. You have Rodney Lil Rod Jones, a producer who lived with Combs and worked extensively on his most recent project, The Love Album, which was nominated for a Grammy in 2023.
Right.
Jones filed a massive, incredibly detailed federal lawsuit alleging not just sexual assault, but racketeering, claiming he was forced to procure sex workers and engage in illicit activities.
You also have Adria English, a former adult film actor who filed a lawsuit claiming she was hired as a dancer for the infamous white parties in the Hamptons in Miami, but was then systematically trafficked and forced to engage in sex work with party guests.
You have Salia Graves filing a suit stating she was drugged, bound, and raped by Combs and his bodyguard at his recording studio in 2001, and that she recently learned the entire incident was recorded and distributed.
And the singer, Dawn Richard, a former member of Danity Kane, a group Combs formed on national television, alleging severe battery and sex trafficking. The sheer volume, the geographic spread, and the terrifying consistency of the allegations, spanning over 30 years, from college students to professional colleagues. It painted a picture that federal prosecutors could not ignore.
This was no longer a matter of isolated interpersonal civil disputes. The pattern suggested a deeply entrenched, highly organized system of behavior. And while the civil suits are dominating the entertainment blogs and the tabloids, the federal government is moving quietly, building a criminal case.
Which leads us directly to the events of March 2024. Homeland Security Investigations executes those massive raids we talked about at the top of the show.
Right. And when you look at the mechanics of a federal raid of that magnitude, it requires signing off from high-level federal judges, which means the government had to present overwhelming probable cause that crimes were committed and that evidence of those crimes was currently located on those properties.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The tactical gear, the armored vehicles, it signaled to the world that the Department of Justice viewed Sean Combs not as a celebrity embroiled in a scandal, but as a high-level target of a major criminal investigation.
The raids were the turning point. 6 months later, in September 2024, the hammer drops. Sean Combs is indicted by a federal grand jury in Manhattan. He is formally arrested in a hotel lobby in New York. The charges are breathtaking: racketeering conspiracy, sex trafficking by force, fraud or coercion, and transportation to engage in prostitution.
And perhaps the most telling detail of the immediate arraignment: he is denied bail.
Even with that massive offer.
Yeah, his high-priced defense team offered a $50 million bond package, offering to surrender his passport, subject himself to GPS monitoring, and restrict his visitors. But the federal judges denied bail 3 separate times.
Why?
They specifically cited a severe, documented risk of witness intimidation, obstruction of justice, and a history of contacting potential witnesses. He was remanded to the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, a notoriously grim federal holding facility, to await trial.
I really want to dive into the legal architecture of this indictment because it is fascinating. U.S. Attorney Damian Williams, the lead prosecutor in the Southern District of New York, didn't just charge Combs as a wealthy individual who committed isolated acts of violence. He framed the entire operation as a syndicate.
Right. He utilized the IQ Act and the Mann Act.
Let's start with ICO. How does a law designed for the mafia get applied to a music executive?
Well, what's fascinating here is how RICO functions. It stands for the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. It was passed by Congress in 1970 specifically to dismantle organized crime families. Before RICO, it was incredibly difficult to prosecute a mob boss because they rarely committed the underlying crimes themselves. They ordered underlings to do it.
Okay, that makes sense.
RICO allows prosecutors to charge the leader of an enterprise for the crimes committed by the organization as a whole, as long as they can prove a pattern of racketeering activity designed to further the goals of that enterprise.
So the government argued that the Combs enterprise wasn't some shadowy underground mob operating out of social clubs. It was his actual legitimate business empire. The indictment alleged that the enterprise was bad boy entertainment. It was Combs Global.
Exactly. They argued that he weaponized his corporate infrastructure. He allegedly used his corporate staff, the high-level supervisors, the personal assistants, the private security teams, the household staff, to facilitate, conceal, and protect his pattern of abuse.
The prosecution alleged these employees were the logistics team for his crimes. They booked the hotel rooms, they procured the narcotics, they handled the cash payments to sex workers, and they cleaned up the hotel rooms afterward to hide the evidence from law enforcement.
And the absolute core of these logistical operations, the dark center of the indictment, were the events that Combs referred to as the freak-offs. The indictment describes these as elaborate, multi-day, highly produced sexual performances with male sex workers.
The government alleged a very specific, chilling methodology. They claimed Combs used his immense power, promises of career advancement, and threats of professional ruin to lure female victims into his orbit.
Right. Once they were isolated, he would use force, psychological coercion, and a steady, controlled supply of heavy narcotics, specifically ketamine, ecstasy, and GHB, to compel them to participate in these days-long events.
The indictment alleged he would direct the encounters, masturbate while watching, and routinely record them electronically without the victim's consent. And the recordings are the ultimate leverage.
Yeah.
The prosecution argued he used this vast library of explicit, compromising footage as perpetual blackmail to ensure the silence and compliance of the victims. And because these freak-offs didn't just happen in New York, they happened in Miami, Los Angeles, Atlanta, and internationally, that triggers the Mann Act charges.
Right. The Mann Act, originally passed in 1910 as the White Slave Traffic Act, is a federal law that makes it a felony to transport any individual across state lines or internationally with the intent that they engage in prostitution or any illegal sexual activity.
Wait, I'm confused. If he's flying on his own private jet with people he claims are his consenting romantic partners, how does the government prove a Mann Act violation?
That is precisely where the logistics of the enterprise come in. The government doesn't have to prove that the person on the jet was in handcuffs. They have to prove the intent of the transportation.
Okay.
If the prosecution can show a paper trail text to assistants, wire transfers to travel agents, hotel bookings, proving that Combs orchestrated the movement of sex workers or victims across state lines, specifically to participate in the coerced, drug-fueled freak-offs that constitutes a federal crime, it transforms a localized incident of abuse into interstate federal trafficking.
That sets the stage perfectly. It wasn't framed as a wild party getting out of hand. The prosecution framed it as a highly organized, corporate-backed, heavily funded system of human exploitation. Which brings us directly inside the Manhattan federal courthouse for the trial itself, May to July of 2025.
Presiding over the case is Judge Arun Subramanian. This was, without exaggeration, the trial of the decade.
The media frenzy outside the courthouse was reminiscent of the O.J. Simpson or Michael Jackson trials.
Over the course of 29 grueling days of testimony, the jury heard from 34 witnesses. They saw hundreds of text messages, financial records, flight logs, and hotel receipts. But the emotional and narrative center of the prosecution's entire case was undoubtedly the testimony of Cassie Ventura.
She was on the witness stand for days, and reading the trial transcripts, her testimony was incredibly methodical. She walked the jury through the devastating reality of that power dynamic.
She talked about how it started off completely platonic when she was 19 and he was in his late 30s, how he positioned himself as a protector, looking out for her career in a predatory industry.
But then she detailed how the boundaries slowly blurred, how the isolation tactics began, and how the coercion took root.
She detailed a moment on a yacht in Miami where she was first introduced to ecstasy, claiming it was presented not as a choice, but as a requirement of being in his inner circle. She described the horrific reality of the freak-offs, testifying that she was forced to participate in hundreds of them over the years.
Wow.
She described the physical exhaustion, the immense quantities of 5E fluids required to recover from the drug binges, and the constant suffocating fear that he would leak the tapes if she ever tried to leave.
The specific details she provided to the jury were just harrowing. She spoke about an incident at the 2013 Cannes Film Festival. She testified that after a severe argument where Combs falsely accused her of dealing drugs to other celebrities, he physically attacked her and kicked her off their chartered yacht, completely barefoot, in a foreign country, with no phone and no passport.
And she connected the past abuse directly to her present trauma.
Yes, she recounted an incident in early 2023, right before she filed her civil lawsuit. She testified that she was suffering from such horrible PTSD flashbacks that her husband had to physically restrain her, tackling her to the floor of their home to stop her from walking out their front door and directly into active traffic.
It was devastating testimony that painted a picture of absolute psychological destruction. But the federal prosecutors knew that relying on a single witness in a case of this magnitude leaves room for the defense to attack her credibility. So they didn't just rely on Ventura.
Right, they brought in a procession of other women to establish the undeniable pattern of the enterprise. Let's talk about the witness identified in the transcripts only as Jane.
Her testimony provided a really clear look at what financial coercion actually looks like in practice. Jane testified that she felt entirely obligated to participate in these multi-day hotel encounters because Combs was paying her rent.
But he wasn't just giving her a check. He controlled the lease. She testified that she feared losing the home where she lived with her young son if she ever refused his demands. And she told the jury he explicitly threatened to leak explicit, secretly recorded videos of her to her child's father if she didn't comply. That is the definition of feeling trapped.
Then you had the testimony of Mia, a former personal assistant who worked inside the Combs global offices. Mia testified about witnessing physical assaults and being subjected to sexual assaults herself. But the defense team immediately pounced on her during cross-examination.
They pointed out that long after she had left his employment and long after the alleged assaults, Mia had made glowing social media posts praising Sean Combs as a visionary mentor.
And Mia's explanation to the jury on redirect was incredibly revealing about the nature of the media shield. She testified that she praised him online out of sheer, unadulterated fear.
She knew he monitored what former employees said about him.
Exactly. And she knew that if she didn't publicly perform loyalty, she would be blacklisted from the entertainment industry forever. She was managing a volatile threat.
We really need to look closely at the defense strategy here, because they were facing a mountain of allegations. Combs was represented by top-tier defense attorneys Mark Agnifilo and Tenny Geragos. Their strategy was aggressive and deeply controversial.
They didn't deny that the freak-offs happened. They didn't deny the heavy drug use or the presence of sex workers. Instead, they tried to completely dismantle the narrative of force, fraud, or coercion, which are the specific legal requirements for a federal sex trafficking conviction.
Right. They essentially painted the entire trial as a fake trial, a witch hunt driven by financial motives, opportunism, and jealousy over a wealthy black man's success. With witnesses like Jane and Cassie, Agnifilo and Geragos projected dozens of private text messages, emails, and voicemails onto the screens in the courtroom, messages that appeared loving, affectionate, or highly sexual.
They pointed to the lavish gifts, the private jets, the designer bags. They were trying to frame these relationships not as trafficking, but as mutually beneficial, toxic, highly chaotic, but ultimately consensual adult relationships. They were hammering away, trying to inject reasonable doubt into the minds of the jurors regarding the coercion element.
But just as the defense was making headway muddying the waters around consent, the prosecution pivoted and brought in testimony that spoke directly to the sheer, terrifying physical intimidation tactics of the enterprise. They needed to prove that crossing Sean Combs resulted in actual violence.
And that is when Scott Mescudi, known globally as the rapper Kid Cudi, takes the witness stand.
This was a pivotal, almost cinematic moment in the trial. The courtroom was dead silent. Kid Cudi testified that he had briefly dated Cassie Ventura back in 2011 during a short window when she was trying to break away from Combs. Cudi told the jury that Combs eventually found out about the relationship.
And shortly after, Cudi's home in Los Angeles was broken into. And then, a few weeks later, his car was completely firebombed, exploding in his driveway in the middle of the night.
To connect the dots for the jury and prove that the firebombing wasn't a random act of vandalism, the prosecution calls Capricorn Clark to the stand. Clark was a former high-level employee of Combs, the director of global brand marketing for Sean John.
Her testimony was straight out of a mob movie. Clark testified that on the exact morning of the initial break-in at Kid Cudi's house, Sean Combs showed up at her personal apartment furiously angry. She claimed he was holding a gun, demanding to know why she, as his employee and Ventura's friend, hadn't warned him about the relationship with Cudi.
She told the jury that Combs essentially kidnapped her at gunpoint right out of her apartment. He forced her into an SUV with his head of security, and they drove directly to Cudi's house. She alleged that during the ride, Combs explicitly told her they were going to kill him.
Clark testified that Cudi wasn't home when they arrived, but she said she waited terrified in the vehicle while Combs and his security team physically breached the house, matching the timeline of the break-in Cudi had testified about.
Now, the defense fought this fiercely. During cross-examination, Agnifilo pointed out that Capricorn Clark returned to work for Combs multiple times over the subsequent years, suggesting her narrative of a gunpoint kidnapping was fabricated.
But when you layer Clark's testimony over Kid Cudi's testimony, over Cassie's testimony, over the hotel surveillance video, the cumulative effect on the jury was overwhelming.
It really was. It painted a vivid portrait of a man who used a sophisticated network of fear, surveillance, and violence to maintain absolute control over his ecosystem.
So after 7 weeks of this grueling, emotionally exhausting testimony, the defense rests. The closing arguments are delivered, and the case goes to the anonymous jury. And what happens next surprised a lot of the legal analysts who are covering the trial day to day. On July 2, 2025, after several days of deliberation, the jury delivers a highly nuanced, split verdict.
Let's break down exactly what the jury decided, because it is complex. Sean Combs is acquitted of the overarching Arco racketeering conspiracy charge. He is also acquitted of the primary charge of sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion. But he is found guilty on 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution under the Mann Act.
Hold on, let me stop you there, because I know people listening are going to be confused by that.
Yeah.
How does a jury listen to all of that horrific testimony about kidnapping, firebombing, and drug-fueled coercion and decide to acquit him on the Arco and sex trafficking charges, but convict him on the transportation charges? Isn't that legally contradictory?
It seems contradictory on its face, but it actually reveals how meticulously the jury followed the letter of the law rather than just voting on his morality. By acquitting him of RICO, the jury essentially decided that the government failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the entirety of his corporate structure bad boy, Sean John, revolt was functioning primarily as a criminal syndicate under the very strict, specific definitions of that 1970 statute.
Oh, I see. They saw dirty businesses, but not necessarily a mafia family.
Exactly. And regarding the acquittal on the sex trafficking charges, it suggests that the defense's aggressive strategy actually worked to a degree. By plastering those affectionate text messages and highlighting the financial benefits the witnesses received, Agnifilo and Garrigo successfully created just enough reasonable doubt about the legal definition of coercion in the minds of the jurors.
If even one juror believes a victim might have consented for financial gain, they cannot convict on trafficking by force or fraud.
But the Mann Act is where the paper trail caught up with him. I was talking to a legal analyst about this, and they used a great analogy. It is exactly like prosecuting Al Capone for tax evasion in the 1930s.
Oh, that's a perfect analogy.
Right. The feds knew Capone was a murderous mob boss orchestrating the St. Valentine's Day massacre, but they couldn't get the overarching syndicate charges to stick because the witnesses were dead or terrified. But they got him on the logistics. They got him on the accounting paper trail.
The jury didn't convict Combs on the overarching umbrella of being a mafia boss, But they looked at the flight logs. They looked at the wire transfers paying for the sex workers' plane tickets. They looked at the hotel receipts. The specific, undeniable, tangible acts of moving people across state and international borders for the explicit purpose of illegal commercial sex fare. The logistics of the freak-offs. That was the thread that ultimately unraveled the entire sweater.
The paper trail is immune to reasonable doubt about emotional coercion, and the consequences of catching him on those logistical charges were incredibly severe. On October 3, 2025, Sean Combs stands before Judge Subramanian for sentencing.
He declines to speak on his own behalf, right?
Yes, he does. The judge sentences him to 50 months in federal prison, that is 4 years and 2 months behind bars, along with a $500,000 fine and 5 years of heavily monitored supervised release.
Factoring in the time he had already served at the Metropolitan Detention Center while awaiting trial, his projected release date is currently set for May of 2028. He was transferred to FCI Fort Dix, a low-security federal correctional institution in New Jersey where he remains today. His legal team immediately filed an appeal, and they have managed to secure a fast-track hearing before the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, which is scheduled for April 2026.
But I want to zoom out from the courtroom because the 50-month federal sentence was only half the story. The cultural fallout, the complete and total dismantling of his billion-dollar business empire. It was swift, it was brutal, and it was absolute. It was a complete corporate exile unlike anything we have ever seen in the entertainment industry.
We witnessed the unspooling of a highly diversified portfolio almost overnight. This goes back to our earlier discussion about vertical integration. When you are the brand and the brand becomes toxic, every subsidiary collapses simultaneously. Macy's, which had been a massive retail partner for decades, quietly but immediately pulled the entire Sean John clothing line from all their stores and digital platforms.
And the Diageo situation is fascinating. Diageo, the spirits giant, formally severed all ties with him regarding Ciroc vodka and De Leon tequila. They invoked the morality clauses in their joint venture contracts and effectively took full, outright ownership of the brands, completely cutting off one of his most massive revenue streams.
Didn't stop there. Hulu, which was in the middle of producing a highly anticipated reality show centered around his family and his daughters, immediately canceled production and shelved the footage. Under immense pressure from the board, he was forced to step down as chairman of Revolt TV, the network he founded, and eventually sell his equity stake entirely. Major e-commerce brands and luxury retailers fled his Empower global platform. His economic machinery was systematically dismantled piece by piece in a matter of weeks.
And it wasn't just the corporate businesses. It was a profound civic repudiation. Institutions that had gladly taken his money and his prestige for years suddenly rushed to scrub his name from their buildings. Howard University, his beloved alma mater, took the unprecedented step of revoking his honorary degree and formally returning millions of dollars in financial donations he had made over the years.
The mayor of New York City formally rescinded his key to the city, demanding he return the physical award. The media shield that had seemingly protected him from every billet since 1999 dissolved completely.
Which forces us to look at the paperwork of complicity and ask a very uncomfortable multi-million-dollar question. As we watch this rapid corporate distancing, how did so many elite corporate boards, veteran executives, and legacy brands work so intimately with him for decades if these allegations, these so-called open secrets, were permeating the music industry the entire time?
This raises an important question about corporate complicity, doesn't it? If you talk to anyone who worked in hip-hop media in the 2000s, the rumors about Combs' behavior were ubiquitous. They were baked into the culture.
So when Diageo or Macy's cut ties within 48 hours of a lawsuit being filed, it doesn't look like a sudden, shocking moral awakening. It looks like a rapid, pre-calculated risk management protocol. They tolerated the behavior when it was profitable and hidden behind NDAs, and they jettisoned the asset the moment the public relations math inverted.
And the reaction within the music industry itself mirrored that corporate calculation. You had this deafening, highly conspicuous silence from his immediate inner circle. Think about the hundreds of A-list celebrities who attended the white parties. Think about the artists who built their entire careers alongside him, the producers who shared studios with him.
The vast majority of them suddenly had absolutely nothing to say. They vanished from the discourse, terrified of being subpoenaed or targeted by association.
But beyond that terrified inner circle, the broader reaction within hip-hop was deeply fractured. It became a proxy war for larger cultural grievances. On one side, you had artists like Kanye West taking to social media. West was tweeting things like Free Puff and framing the federal prosecution as some sort of overarching racist elite conspiracy.
But if you look at mainstream pop culture, the verdict has already been rendered. The erasure is nearly complete. Look at the pop star Kesha. Her 2009 breakout hit song TikTok famously opens with the line, "Wake up in the morning feeling like P. Diddy," referencing his status as the ultimate party icon.
Right, right.
Following the release of the Cassie video, Kesha permanently changed the lyrics during all her live performances to explicitly say, "F.P. Diddy." Furthermore, the phrase "no Diddy" became ubiquitous viral slang online, completely replacing older phrases. He transitioned from being a symbol of aspiration to a punchline and a cautionary tale.
One of the socio-legal analyses we reviewed for this deep dive described this specific historical moment as the death of the 90s mogul tier. The artists from that era who built massive conglomerates, Jay-Z, Dr. Dre, Diddy, they maintained their power through that vertical integration we discussed.
But Combs's empire proved uniquely vulnerable to the systemic risk of his own monstrous personal conduct. When the corporate partners, the load-bearing walls of his empire, withdrew their support, the entire structure collapsed onto itself.
So as we review all of these sources, all of these transcripts, what does this ultimately mean for you, the listener? We are left grappling with a massive, seemingly unresolvable legacy question. How do we as a culture separate the defining soundtrack of the 1990s, the hits from Biggie Smalls, the emergence of Mary J. Blige, the entirety of the bad boy era that shaped millions of lives, from the man who ruthlessly orchestrated it all?
So what does this all mean? It's the ultimate art versus the artist dilemma, but on an industrial scale. Because the tragedy of the victims and the musical reckoning of the era are now permanently, inextricably intertwined. He built a brilliant, undeniable machine that elevated him to unimaginable heights of wealth and influence.
But ultimately, that very same machine, the corporate structure, the public, the legal system, decided he was a liability he could no longer stomach protecting.
It represents a profound, permanent, historical shift in how the entertainment industry deals with systemic abuse and power. The era of the untouchable gatekeeper, insulated by staggering wealth, aggressive philanthropy, and sheer celebrity, has faced a severe, undeniable, and highly public stress test.
It really has. And the reverberations of this case are going to be felt for a very long time. We've covered a massive amount of ground today, navigating through decades of history and thousands of pages of legal documents. We want to thank you for going on this heavy journey with us.
It is absolutely not an easy topic to digest, but it is a vital, necessary piece of modern cultural and legal history to understand.
Absolutely. The structural implications of this trial, the use of the Mann Act, and the collapse of the media shield will be studied in law schools, business schools, and cultural history courses for decades to come.
Before we go, we want to leave you with one final, lingering thought to mull over. We've spent the last hour talking deeply about the man, his actions, and the businesses he built. But I want you to really think about the underlying concept of institutional enablement.
Yeah, that's key.
If a criminal enterprise, or even just a sprawling, decades-long machine of toxic behavior requires logistics, if it requires payroll departments, non-disclosure agreements drafted by high-priced lawyers, private security teams clearing hallways, hotel management looking the other way, and corporate PR fixers spinning the narrative, then the reckoning cannot possibly end with just one man sitting in a low-security cell at Fort Dix.
It is physically impossible for one person to execute abuse on that scale alone. It requires an entire, highly paid ecosystem of complicity to function smoothly.
Exactly. So the next time you look at a towering, seemingly untouchable titan in any industry, whether it is music, Silicon Valley tech, or Wall Street finance, look past the glossy magazine covers and the philanthropic awards. Ask yourself, how much of their immense, unquestioned power relies entirely on the silent, salaried complicity of the dozens of people standing right behind them in the shadows? Because history shows us that if the foundation is rotting, eventually the entire skyscraper is going to come down.